So you're thinking about learning to keep bees and you're wondering what's involved. I get questions about this all the time. This presentation is just a brief overview of what I think it takes to raise bees and why I think you should seriously consider attending one of the bee schools, or at the very least joining one of the bee clubs for support. Before I get started talking about the things that I think you're going to need to learn about, or at least think about if you're going to take up beekeeping, I want to cover some of the general guiding principles that may be helpful in navigating the world of beekeeping. So the first one is, for the most part, no two beekeepers have the same opinion. And there's a kind of running joke in the beekeeping community that if you ask 10 beekeepers a question, you'll get 12 different answers. So if you talk to another beekeeper and they tell you something different than what I cover here, don't be surprised. The second thing is there's a lot of research going on right now, and we're finding out things that we thought were true are not necessarily the case anymore. So some of the stuff that I cover in this presentation might be dated by the time you have a chance to look at it. This is also going to be true for things that you read in books or things that you see on the internet. So you probably should keep that in mind. The third thing is what works in one area of the state or the country will not necessarily work in another part. And as you learn more about beekeeping and how the weather and what's growing around you affects your bees, it'll become a lot clearer why that's true. And then the final thing is bees adapt to their environment, and the beekeeper is part of the environment. So what works for another beekeeper may not work for you and your bees. And that's important to keep in mind, because if you get advice that doesn't ring true for you, my advice is to trust your instincts and trust your bees. So this quote pretty much sums up what beekeeping is like these days, and I came across this in a book a friend sent me a few years ago. Keeping bees is relatively simple, like raising children is relatively simple. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to cover a little bit of history about bees and beekeeping. So there's evidence that honeybees have been around for at least 100 million years, and there's also evidence that humans have been taking honey from bees for at least 8,000 years. So why start with history? Well, we've been learning about bees since prehistoric times, clearly, and we're still learning something new on a pretty much uh, daily basis. So with that in mind, it shouldn't be a surprise to hear that there's a lot to learn and it can be overwhelming at times. And with that in mind, you're going to need to start somewhere, so you may as well go to one of the local bee schools, and there's a link to the North Carolina State Beekeepers Association um, page that includes some of the bee schools going on locally. And even if you've heard that the local bee class is just a bunch of old guys reading from PowerPoint slides, I promise you'll get something out of it, and at least you'll know kind of in general terms the kind of stuff you ought to be learning about and focusing on. And the other thing that's really good is you'll meet other beekeepers who will be able to support you along the way. And one of the things that you're going to hear from time to time in the arguments for not putting a lot of effort into keeping honeybees is that honeybees are not native to the U.S. And there's some evidence that they were here at one time, but the European honeybees that we currently have probably came from England to Virginia in about 1622. Um, but the other thing that you really need to keep in mind is a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we enjoy today are not native either, and they need bees for pollination. And in cases like the almonds, they actually need honeybees for pollination. So 80% of the world's almond production comes from California, and pollination takes place pretty much in February and the first couple weeks of March every year. And in 2018, they're estimating that they're going to need 1.9 million hives to do that pollination. So once the honeybees got here, they thrived. They did really, really well. And in fact, the Native Americans referred to them as the white man's fly. But starting around the 1940s, changes that we were making started to affect the honeybees and also the other native bees and other kinds of pollinators. Things like monocropping, the increase of pesticides, effects of large-scale pollination services where we're trucking bees around the country, and also loss of forage due to urbanization. But the bees adapted pretty well, and keeping bees was still pretty easy. And you didn't have to go to bee school, and you didn't have to learn so much back then. You could pretty much just have a few beehives on your property and leave them alone and just take honey from them once or twice a year. And it was really more bee having than what we think of as beekeeping today. So, what happened that so drastically changed the way that we do beekeeping today? Well, two pests were introduced into the United States that affect the bees drastically. Uh, One of them is the Varroa destructor. It's also known as the Varroa mite, and it was introduced in 1987. And this pest came from Asia. Another one was the small hive beetle, and it was first detected around 1998, and it came from Africa. And the two of these pests, more than anything that's been going on, have changed the way that we keep bees and are the main reasons why beekeepers need to know so much in order to be able to keep their bees healthy and alive. So now that you know a little bit about the background and kind of what's going on with bees and why we really need to learn a little bit more, I'm going to start to go through some things that I think may be helpful for you to learn about so that you can be a successful beekeeper. So the first thing that's important to understand is beekeeping has changed, and now it's no different than raising other farm animals. So one of the things is you need to make sure you have space available. A strong colony of bees is going to need an acre of foraging space, or you're going to need to supplement food. So not just an acre of space, but an acre of space with forage that they can actually get pollen and nectar from. And if you live in an agricultural setting, um, this is not going to be a concern. But if you live in an urban setting, you're going to need to make sure that you're allowed to have bees on your property, and that you need to pay attention to what some of the restrictions are regarding having bees on your property. So there may be limits to how many hives you can have. There may be restrictions on how far your hives need to be from the property line. So those are things you're going to need to learn about. You're going to need to have a sunny space to keep the bees. It used to be that bees could be in the trees in the woods, and in fact, we pretty much made sure that the hives were sort of along the forest edges or maybe actually under the trees, and that's no longer the case. The hive beetles and the varroa mites in particular have changed it. So the more sun on the bees, the better. Um, and then finally, you need to make sure that your neighbors are okay with it. And um, there's just so much that um, with honeybees in an urban setting where you really do have to be aware of what's going on with your neighbors. So if your neighbors are doing pest control for like mosquito and termite treatments, you really want to be talking to your neighbors and making sure that they understand that you have bees, and if they let you know in advance when they're going to have treatments, that way you can make sure that your bees are not out and exposed to it. The other thing is if your neighbors are afraid of bees and they have either particularly enticing smelly water on their property, or they have plants that are going to attract the bees, they're going to do whatever they feel comfortable doing to protect themselves from bees. And unfortunately, what that can mean is pesticides being put out that'll be brought back to your hives and will take out the whole hive. So start by talking to your bees before, or your neighbors before you get bees, and make sure that you have some kind of an arrangement and understanding about how you're going to handle different situations as they come up. The next thing that you need to think about is how you're going to actually use your bees. And being a hobby beekeeper with 10 to 15 hives is going to be very different from being a commercial beekeeper having, maybe 100 or 1,000 hives. You're going to need to learn different things. You're going to need to be prepared to do different things. So think about that up front. What are you going to do with your bees when you get them? Why are you getting the bees? And then the big thing is you're going to need to be trained. Like I said, you can't really just be a bee haver anymore. You're going to need to learn a lot of stuff to to learn how to take care of your bees and and keep them safe. And this is where going to a bee class will really help get you going. So what kind of things are you going to need to learn about? Well, you're going to need to learn about the colony, its organization, and bee biology, and what all that entails. So every time you get in your hive to do an inspection and see how things are going, you're going to need to identify some things like basic stuff like what's a queen look like? What do the drones, which are the males, look like, and how many are there? How are the worker bees doing, and how do they look? And one of the big things related to the bees in general is understanding the 4 stages of development. Because every time we get into the hive, we're going to be using the various stages of the development to be able to figure out how healthy our bees are and what's going on with them, and uh, early warnings to problems that we're going to have to deal with. So there are 4 stages. Stage 1 is the eggs, and that's what you're seeing here on the right side of this picture. Stage 2 are the larvae, and that's what you're seeing on the left side. Stage 3 is the pupal stage, and by then, once they go to the pupal stage, the worker bees will cap them. And so we'll need to know all about those things. And here's the 4th stage, which is the adult bee. And so here's a picture of an emerging bee, and it's always great fun to see bees emerging. And the first 3 stages we collectively label as brood, and here's a picture that shows brood, and it's got the capped worker brood and the capped drone brood, and you're going to need to be able to identify what those look like in the frames, because every time you go in and you're looking at a frame, um, you're what you see will make a big will mean something to you, and it'll make a big difference on how you can identify what's going on with your bees. So not just uh, what what the brood looks like, but how much there is and the different patterns and what that will tell us. In addition to looking at brood and brood patterns, you're going to also need to know about how things are arranged in the hive. So here's an example of a frame that has brood, and on the outside of the brood is the pollen, which is fed to the baby bees, the larva, and then the honey is above that, and some of it's capped and some of it is still open. And so you really need to understand about how things are arranged in the hive, because you can, if you're rearranging things without understanding how it's meant to be, you can really make a mess for your bees. So that's some of the stuff you're going to need to learn. The other thing is worker bees have a life cycle that's really, really pretty amazing, and they do all these different jobs. The worker bees really are the workers in the hive, and so it's really amazing to see during their life cycle the different jobs they take on. In addition to, as you learn about the life cycle, you also learn about some of the anatomy of the bees and some of the specialized parts they have. So for example, on the left side you'll see a honeybee worker bee out gathering pollen, and you can see the pollen that's in their pollen baskets, and so that's one of the uh, uh, parts of their anatomy that's unique to the worker bee. And then another on the right side is a worker bee that is actually extruding wax. So a lot of people don't have a clue where the wax comes from. Well, it comes from actually from the worker bee at one stage in their life cycle. And so learning about all that is is not only useful in keeping your bees alive, but just so interesting. The next thing you're going to need to do once you're trained and you have some idea about what you're in for is to think about getting equipment, bees, and various safety gear. Um, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is equipment. And in North Carolina, I don't know about other states, but in North Carolina, there are 4 types of hives that can be used. Other types are considered illegal, and they all have removable frames. And they all cost somewhere around $250 to $350 per colony setup, unless you build your own. So the most common one is the Langstroth hive, and that's the one that you typically see if you're out and you see hives around um, fields. It's typically the Langstroth hive. So that's the most common one, and it uses four-sided frames, and there's a couple of different configurations that you can pick from for your own setup, and you can learn about that and figure out what works best for you. The second kind, and this is becoming a lot more common, this wasn't for a long time, but in the last few years, top bar hives have started to be used a lot more in the United States. And there's two kinds. There's the Kenyan and the Tanzanian. The Kenyan is the most common with the sloping sides, and that doesn't use a four-sided frame. It actually only has the top bar, as you would expect from the name top bar hive, and then the bees build their wax down from that. Another kind of hive that is starting to be used more in the US and is called the horizontal or long hive, and they actually use four-sided frames as well, and they're typically a little different shape than the Langstroth hive. The Langstroth tend to be wider and not as deep as the horizontal and long hive frames. And then a hive that you'll run into once in a while um, that is kind of a cross between a top bar and a Langstroth is called a Warre hive, and it uses just the top bar like the top bar hives, but instead of going horizontal, you just stack boxes to grow it like you would the Langstroth. So those are the four different kinds of hives that are typically seen in North Carolina and are used in North Carolina. So once you have some idea about the kind of hive you're going to get and what kind of equipment you're going to get, then you're going to need to think about getting bees. And there are currently three ways to get bees if you're starting a new hive. Once you have bees, there's other ways that you can create more hives, but this is really targeting um, starting new hives. So the first way to get bees is through a swarm, and swarms are sort of nature's way of reproducing a colony. And if you get a swarm, that's free bees, unless there's something really wrong with the bees, either poor genetics or they've got varroa and they've got diseases that they're taking with them. So that's the first thing. The next um, way to get bees is something called a nuke, and that's what's shown here on the right top picture. And a nuke is really kind of a mini hive. So it's 4 or 5 frames of bees, and it includes not just the bees, but also brood and a queen that's already laying and is already acclimated to the hive, and also 1 or 2 frames that'll have food on it, pollen and honey. So you can just take those and put them right into your equipment. And then the final way to get bees is the one on the bottom, and that's a packages of bees, and that's typically 3 pounds of bees plus a queen, a mated queen, and 3 pounds of bees is typically 10 to 15,000 bees, 10 to 12,000 bees. Um, and um, once you get your bees, then you have to figure out how you install them in your equipment. So that'll be something else that you'll need to learn about. So now we have equipment, now we have bees, and now we need to think about safety equipment for the beekeeper. So at a minimum, you'll need a bee veil, a smoker, and a hive tool. And there's lots and lots of other things that you can get. And you could do an inexpensive bee veil, or you could do something more like an inspection jacket with a veil or a full bee suit. And if you're just doing an inexpensive veil and an inexpensive smoker and hive tool, you'll probably spend about $75. But if you want to do a better smoker, either an inspection jacket or a full bee suit, and there's a couple of different kinds of hive tools available, you can spend 150 to 200 or more dollars fairly easily. And one of the things is some beekeepers sort of opt to go without any kind of protective clothing. And if you decide to do that, it's really a pretty good idea to keep a bee veil available anyway, because you really don't ever know what you're going to get into. And we need to keep in mind that honeybees are wild animals, and that means you really don't know. And any experienced beekeeper will tell you that they're not going to know for sure when they open a hive what they're going to find. So if you decide that you don't need to wear protective clothing, that's kind of your choice. But I would ask that if you're modeling behavior for either young people or a new beekeeper, please wear a veil and show good practice by respecting the fact that these are wild animals. And if you get, you know, bad things can happen with stings, especially stings to the eyes. Okay, so the next thing we're going to need to talk about is feeding the bees. So in North Carolina, we basically have nec two major nectar flows. One comes in the spring and one comes in the fall. And in between, there's really not enough flowering plants to provide enough food for the bees if you miss either the spring or the fall nectar flow. So you might need to feed the bees. And even with the spring and fall nectar flow, you might need to feed your bees. And typically, you can feed them sugar syrup. You can also provide pollen patties for them. And one thing, we don't really have any control over the weather. So in 2017, we actually got rain during the spring nectar flow that pretty much washed out most of the nectar. And so we ended up having to feed the bees a lot more than we normally would. And then we had a drought, which affected the nectar flow for fall. So 2017, we were feeding bees all year long. And that's happened in other states as well. And like I said, we never really know what we're going to get. So be prepared to feed your bees. Um, and the other thing about feeding the bees is um, in North Carolina, through the winter, we lose 20 to 30% of our colonies. And one of the biggest reasons that we lose colonies is because of insufficient food, and the bees actually starve to death. Um, and it's usually in February when the queens are laying and the brood is expanding and they're needing to eat a lot. So you really do have to make sure that your bees have enough food and pay attention to that all year round. The next thing, which is huge, and this is probably the thing that makes the difference between being a bee haver and a beekeeper, is you need to monitor and treat for pests and diseases. So every beekeeper will encounter the Varroa destructor, a hive beetle, and wax moths. At some point in time, you're going to run into these. And any one of these pests can wipe out a colony of bees in a relatively short amount of time. But diseases vectored by the Varroa destructor, which right now, that the last I've heard was 24 known viruses and maybe a new bacteria, account for almost all of the deaths of bees in the United States. And if you don't monitor your Varroa count, then and treat if when the counts go over the threshold, there's a really, really good chance that you're going to lose your bees. And not only that, you'll probably affect any bees within any colonies within a 3-mile radius of you. So um, that's one of the things that we really pay attention to. And if you don't want to use pesticide treatments in the hive, that's totally understandable. There's a lot of non-pesticide, what we would call natural or organic treatments available. And there's lots of information readily available about their effectiveness and how you do it and when you do it. So that's something you got to really know about. Also, there are a number of diseases that you're going to probably encounter as you keep bees, and this is just sort of a long list of some of the things we run across. Some of them we're seeing a lot more of. Some of these I've certainly seen related to uh, viruses that are brought on by the varroa mites. So you're going to need to learn about these, and you're going to need to learn how to identify them and then what to do when you find them. And then, of course, there's other pests outside the hives that you're going to need to think about. So, bears, if you're in an area where there are bears, that's a real serious concern, and you'll need to learn how to deal with that. Even if you're in an urban environment, skunks, possums, and raccoons are a real problem. I've certainly had a few run-ins where skunks have been a real problem, and I've had to deal with that. Mice and ants are also kind of ongoing problems, ants in particular. Yellow jackets this year was a particularly bad year for yellow jackets, and they'll take out a hive as well. Neighbors with pesticides, as I said before, you really got to know what your neighbors are doing and when they're going to be doing it so that you can make sure that your bees are safe during that period of time. And then the other thing that is becoming a real serious problem, as I said, if you're not treating your bees and monitoring your mite counts and treating them when they're over the threshold, you're probably going to lose your hive, and you're probably going to affect neighboring hives as well. So there's something called varroa bombing that is seriously affecting good beekeepers, where a neighbor isn't taking care of their bees, and then that causes a problem where within a week to 10 days you could lose a hive that's been varroa bombed. So you'll need to learn about that and find out what other beekeepers in your area are doing as well. And then the one of the things that you'll need to do along with monitoring trading is you'll need to keep good records. And there's a couple of ways that you can track information. There's some online apps. HiveTracks is a program that was created in North Carolina at Appalachia State, and then there's some other ones, Healthy Hive and Bee Tight. You can just keep notebooks. A lot of beekeepers do that, or you can track things on calendars. Whatever works for you, and over time you'll figure out what works for you and what information you want to keep. And then as you have questions as you're working in the hive, it'll help give you some idea of some of the things you need to track, like how old is your queen, and where did you get your queen. And if your queen's a year old and failing, knowing where she came from is going to be really important. And then, like I said, tracking mite counts and when you do treatment is going to be really important. And I also track weather patterns, because it starts to give me a little bit of a heads up as weather patterns are changing over time, about when I start to need to think about doing different things, like getting equipment ready because we're going to be heading toward a nectar flow, or starting to do mite counts on a more regular basis, because this is when I started to have varroa bombing in previous years. So things like that. So try to keep good records. And then finally, something that I think is probably the most important thing, and this is the thing that I find the most frustrating for me and also for new beekeepers, is you need to be able to commit the time that's going to be needed to take care of your bees. If you're going to be a beekeeper and not a bee haver, you really need to think about spending time with your bees every 10 days to 2 weeks at the minimum. And like I said, we never know what we're going to find when we get into them. So you may think that I can get in and be out in 15 minutes, and then you find out there's an issue, and now you need 2 hours. So that's something you need to really think about. And according to recent research, 80% of new beekeepers quit within 2 years. And back to talking about equipment and bees, it's not unusual to spend $500 to get up and running with a hive of bees, and that can be pretty expensive. Um, if if you can't keep them alive, and you're losing bees because you don't really have the time. Um, okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the kinds of things you're going to need to learn about, um, let's talk about what some next steps are. So the first thing is to join a bee group. And in North Carolina, we have the North Carolina State Beekeepers and there are about 77, as of the beginning of 2018, about 77 chartered chapters supporting 100 counties. And it's really important to have a beekeeping community to go to for support and to learn from, and also to just get information about what else is going on in your community and in your state. So, for example, when the bee schools are. So, it's like I said before, it's really helpful to take a beekeeping class because it'll help get you started um, with a community and also with understanding what it is you're going to need to learn about. And, basic things, where to get bees, where to get equipment, things like that. And classes are typically 8 to 12 hours of class time plus usually some hands-on time. And classes usually start in mid-January through February. So if you are seeing this and there's not a bee class around you, or you've missed the window where the bee classes are taking place, you might consider doing an online class. And North Carolina State University has an online program called Bees, and you can go there and you can take really, really good classes online. Another thing is read beekeeper magazines like American Bee Journal or Bee Culture. And Bee Culture is kind of one of my favorites, and they, in addition to having a good magazine, they also have um, uh, email. So every day I get, if I sign up for their email news, every day I get an article about something related to beekeeping or native bees or honey or um, uh, you'd be amazed the kinds of things that affect beekeeping and that you need to know about. And so it's kind of nice because on a daily basis I get a little bit of information, and I can, kind of choose to pay attention to it or not and learn something a little bit at a time. So that's been really, really helpful. And then the other thing they do is they have webinars about once a month, and there's something called the Kim and Jim Show. And if you go to beeculture.com, under the events, you'll see the Kim and Jim Show, and you can either watch the webinars live or they record them, and so you can go back and look at them. And it's a lot of really, really good information. And then there are other webinars and videos that you can take advantage of that are done by other groups outside of bee culture. Another thing to seriously think about is to attend some of the conferences that are hosted. So the North Carolina State Beekeepers has two state conferences a year, one in the spring and one in the summer, and they invite some of the leading experts from all over the country, and actually even from other countries, to come and speak about what's been going on. And they also have workshops, and it's really great because you get 600 to 800 people that are varying levels of beekeepers in one place, and so that's always really, really interesting. And the other ones are the Eastern Apiculture Society or the American Bee Federation, and so those are really interesting if you get a chance to go to. It's really important to work with other beekeepers, and a lot of beekeepers will actually let you come and work with them. And it's not a bad idea to take a class and work with other beekeepers before you ever get bees on your own, because uh, it can make a really big difference of like the kind of equipment or the kind of bees you get or how many bees you get or how you keep bees. So think about doing that. Um, Read bee books and articles from the internet, but also keep in mind a couple things. One is the information may be dated, and also keep in mind where it's coming from. Keeping in mind that keeping bees in North Carolina is different from, say, California, Texas, or Minnesota. And even keeping bees in the mountains of North Carolina is going to be different than keeping bees on the coast of North Carolina. So kind of take all that in consideration. And then one of the things that's really, really important is to learn about what's flowering around you, the flowering plants and trees in your area in particular, and what the bees need and what the bees need to thrive. And what could be around you may be different than what's 20 miles away. And before you ever put bees on your property, you really, really need to know what there is for them to eat in your area. Otherwise, you're probably not going to have healthy bees. So it's good to learn about that, and it's also um, good to kind of keep tabs on that because as there's more urban development, that can change quite drastically, and then you're going to need to adapt for that. Okay, so that's kind of a really quick, brief overview of what I think is required if you're going to take up beekeeping. So thank you for your time, and I hope this was all really helpful. On my website, bumblingbeekeeper.com, I'll include some of the links that I used within this presentation, but also some links to things like where you can get bees and where you can get equipment. And there'll also be a PDF version of this presentation if you want to check on it. And then if you want to contact me, you can do so at amy@bumblingbeekeeper.com. So thank you and happy beekeeping.